All right. Hi, everybody. It is John with Murder by the Book coming to you from my living room for another Facebook Friday. Tonight, we're really excited to have David Pepper with us to talk about his new book, The Voter File, which just came out Tuesday. And we're super excited to have Mike Maden here to talk to us about the new Tom Clancy book, which will be out. It's called Firing Point, and it'll actually be out this coming Tuesday. Hi, guys. How are y'all tonight?
Doing great. Thanks for having us, John.
Yeah, doing well. Thanks for having us.
Good. So for those of you that don't know, Mike Maden is the author of the critically acclaimed Drone series and two novels, that actually might be more than that at this point, novels in Tom Clancy's #1 New York Times bestselling Jack Ryan 4, this is an old bio clearly, series. He holds both a master's and a PhD in political science from the University of California at Davis, specializing in international relations and comparative politics. He has lectured and consulted on the topics of war in the Middle East, among others. Maden has served as a political consultant and a campaign manager in the state and national elections and has hosted his very own local weekly radio show. David Pepper is the author of the Jack Sharp series, including the newest one, The Voter File, The Wingman, and The People's House. He earned his BA from Yale University and his JD from Yale Law School. He has clerked for a judge on the United States Court of Appeals, served in a local elected office in Ohio, worked for major law firms, and taught election and voting rights law. Prior to law school, he worked in St. Petersburg, Russia, for the Washington-based Center for Strategic and International Studies. In 2015, he was unanimously elected chairman of the Democratic Party of Ohio. So real easy question to get started. We'll start with you, David. Do you want to give us a little bit of your elevator pitch for the book?
Sure. This is a book that I think people find really timely. It's about it starts with a very sort of quiet election that something looks awry. And then my main character is a reporter who has this strange habit of continuing to find election type scandals. And he stumbles upon this story. He gets called by a person who suspects something's wrong. And before he knows it, he's for the sort of third time in 3 books, figured out that he's at the heart of a much bigger case of election rigging. And obviously in a 2020 election cycle that we're in the middle of, where we're worried about foreign interference, there are a lot of parallels to what's happening. But this is not a presidential election. This is actually gets into, frankly, a lot of the levers of power that come if you are smart enough to win elections at the lower levels. But that also makes it very relevant to 2020 because we know that beyond whether or not Donald Trump gets reelected, all around the country after this year, Mike would know this, every state will be redrawing its districts. Yep. And that's essentially what some of this gets into. So hopefully people find it to be a good story, fun to read, a page turner, but also shed a little light on the real world politics we're all living in.
Yeah, I mean, David, I had a chance to read the Galleys. It's a great read. So congratulations. I think it's a really important and timely book. I think anytime you get bad guys and good guys and guns, but also talk about something really important like election security and voting security, I think it's really important. And you actually, because of your book, it prompted me to do a little more research on things like voter fraud. And I just today came across an article. I didn't realize, every vote counts. It really does. And like you say, you're not talking about the big national elections, local stuff, but the local stuff is what very often drives the national. And I found this one article that said that from 2013 to 2017, there were 56 elections in Ohio that tied, and there were 86 that were decided by 1 vote. So this stuff really, really matters. So again, congratulations on really hitting a terribly important topic at an important time.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. One thing I'll say on that is, and by the way, I have a couple kids at home, and sometimes these meetings get slightly interrupted by that. So I'm trying to fix that problem. And 2 dogs too. One of the things that the book points out also, as you mentioned, is not only are the local elections important, but they're the kind that there's not nearly enough polling or other information so that if something is being done with malfeasance, you wouldn't really know it. I mean, a 500 votes here or there, who knows why that happened? It's not like you're polling in all these races. And that's one of the other opportunities that some bad folks take advantage of, that you kind of not sure who's going to win that local state house race all the time. So if the result might flip, well, you wouldn't have known anyway.
Yeah.
Before I forget, if you guys are watching on Facebook, if you have any questions for either author, just drop them in the Facebook comments. McKenna is monitoring and she'll feed them to me. So when I'm done chatting with the guys, we will have time for your questions as well. So Mike, do you want to give us the elevator pitch for your new one?
Yeah, sure. It's my fourth book in the Jack Ryan Jr. series, featuring Jack Ryan Jr., the son of the iconic president. My books come out every summer and they focus on him specifically. I don't do the larger, bigger world stories that Mark Cameron does in the fall, and he does a fantastic job with that. Having said that, though, Jack Ryan Jr. always falls into an adventure that has high stakes. In this particular story, it's the last day of his vacation, civilian vacation, no operations. He's been through quite a bit in the last year. It's his last day in Spain, his last night in Barcelona. He goes into a bar, grabs a drink. It's crowded, it's festive. If you've ever been to Barcelona, it's just a great town. I mean, they are alive and moving and grooving till all hours. And so as he's just about to leave, he bumps into an old friend from college, a woman he had a relationship with. They're surprised to see each other. She clearly is there to meet somebody. He's got to go. And so they exchange numbers and he can't wait to see her again that night. And he walks out the door and suddenly there's an explosion. He rushes back in, unfortunately, death and destruction. And his friend dies in his arms, whispering, a single word, Sandler. And so that sends Jack off on a mission to find out who her killers are. And at the same time, on the other side of the planet, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, ships are being sunk. And President Ryan and his cabinet are at a loss to find out who's doing it, why they're doing it. It's a seemingly invisible and invincible technological enemy, and they don't know how to deal with it. So amazingly, and almost on purpose, those two stories actually come together at some point. So big stakes, global stakes, but real focus on Jack Jr., who I've really come to love and root for. So because you're doing this series, that also, has some influence on the books, the other books, the Jack Ryan books, do you have to check in with Mark Cameron to say, hey, like, is this character here? I want this character might pop up peripherally in my book. Do you guys have to like check in with each other to see what's going on in the world? We touch base on once or twice a year, mostly just to sort of get a sense. But Tom Colgan is a series editor, so he's like the grand poobah overseeing everything. So he knows what I'm working on. He knows what Mark is working on. If there were any conflicts, he'd let us know. What I love working about on this series and in this franchise, we're given absolute freedom to do what we do. There's just a couple little guardrails that we have to watch out for. Some rules of this particular franchise. For example, Jack Ryan Jr. can never be known or identified in public, which actually spend quite a bit of time in this book explaining how that could be, talking about some of the technologies now with, for example, 23andMe, when you send in a swab to find out who your great grandma was, well, it turns out, where's that data going? It's not secured. It goes out in the world, and it's actually possible to trace people now through any number of means. And so there are actually agencies and organizations that are working to either recover that information or put other information out there to cover it. So all that to say is very few rules, but total creative freedom for me, and same for Mark. So that's why we love doing it. It's so much fun.
So this is sort of a question for both of you guys. How do you write kind of political thrillers kind of in the world that we're living in, where we've got this 24-hour news cycle? It seems like, every day there's kind of a crazier and crazier story that makes, years ago, if you put some of this stuff in fiction, people would just be like, that's not plausible. So how do you balance kind of what's changing so quickly with kind of what people will still really believe is happening?
Yeah, I'll take that on. And I started writing my first book in the series in 2012, and in hindsight, it was a much calmer time. So obviously, plots that I thought would be crazy then are compared to what we're seeing even this week with what we saw at the park.
6 weeks ago, it was calmer time.
Yeah, exactly. Like people wouldn't believe that you're going to clear a crowd with tear gas so you can go to a church. I mean, but I would say the thing I've always tried to do as someone who consumes a lot of sort of political fiction, either writing or on TV, House of Cards or Scandal, is, and I'm sure Mike does this a lot, he's done it a lot longer than I have. I have always tried to use the fact that I know the inside of politics to make it as intensely realistic as possible. Mm-hmm. so that people, so one, it's credible. And two, and this is something that my editor at Putnam said early on, you know, right now with all the crazy stuff in the world, people feel reading fiction is almost like it's not as responsible as reading every nonfiction book to figure out what's happening in the world. Mm-hmm. So one of my goals is I want people to enjoy the story. It needs to be really tied to the real world, so it's credible. But if they're also learning about politics from an insider perspective, it also feels like, okay, they're reading fiction, they have a guilty pleasure, but they're still learning as a citizen. And that means that they sort of are still being part of our community, understanding what's happening. And so one of the biggest compliments I've gotten from my books has always been, wow, that book really scared me. And not because of the violence, but because I present it in a realistic enough way. And then there's a pretty couple bad turns in the plot. And they worry, my gosh, David, could that really happen? And so I really try and ground my books in the true reality of politics. I don't want any plot twists. It's so crazy or so unrealistic that people just say, well, that's not real. And all of a sudden it's so into fiction that it's disconnected from the real world. So it's kind of a balance. You want to be dramatic and exciting, and it's hard to compete with some of that today. But I also think being grounded and really working to be realistic seems to keep people reading for multiple reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you say, David. You know, back in the 60s, they used to say that theater is dead, right? Because life is so absurd. I'm starting to wonder if fiction is on the verge of dying, because reality is just so fascinating and jarring. You know, somewhere between plague and cities on fire and asteroids, you know, crashing toward the planet. Fiction is more of a chore now, in a sense. You know, as you were suggesting before, John, if you write this stuff down, if I wrote today's events down a year ago, people would have said, you're over the top. This is insane. You can't do that. So I agree with you, David. I think it's really important. I think the purpose of fiction is to tell the truth. I really do. Exactly. And that means you've got to conform to reality as much as you possibly can. And so for myself, I'm always monitoring the world. That's just my nature. I'm a very curious person. I'm married to a very curious person, so it's not hard for us to sort of be in constant research mode. And there's so many interesting things going on in the world right now. And then also for me, my other great love is history. And so in some ways we feel like we're cast adrift, or that there are, you know, we're in unheralded times, and how can we possibly find our way out? Well, as we all know, history's prologue. And so in Firing Point, I read Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell. And everyone knows George Orwell for 1984. I mean, he's our Nostradamus. It's amazing what he was writing about is so prescient now. In fact, it's almost like he didn't go far enough. And I know when we first read it, David, you know, when you're younger, this is of course fiction. Now it's all fact. Right. But he really, I think one of his primary places where he began to formulate his thoughts about what 1984 would be was his participation in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 39. And I love that book, and I love George Orwell. And so that was the spark that got me thinking about, you know, what's going on in the world today, and then going back to the Spanish Civil War. Fast forward 2017, Catalonia in modern day Spain, where Barcelona is, voted for a referendum for independence. 92% of Catalonians who voted wanted independence from Spain, from Madrid, and to form their own independent state. And Madrid said no, sent in police, tear gas, riot gear, breaking things up. I imagine that sounds a little familiar to our audience. And fast forward, I believe it's 12 of the politicians involved in that are now in jail, serving 9 to 13-year terms. The president of Catalonia is in exile. Of course, Madrid supported that move, but so did the EU, so did most of the world. And so this whole question of what does it mean to be for self-determination, independence, and voting rights. As Americans from 1776 forward, we resonate with that. Today in America, we resonate with that. So very often you find that both history and other events, you know, always connect with where people are and our ability to say something. Then you put a fictional layer on top of it to sort of make it more palatable and more digestible.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I think is really interesting, especially with a lot of thriller writers that come through, is that so many of y'all are all so kind of in tune with kind of current events and the news and stuff, to the point that it almost seems like when books come out, like you've almost like they line up with kind of almost exactly what's happening. Like every time Daniel Silva comes to the store, people are like, you wrote about this thing and like 2 weeks ago it happened. So do you guys like, so how do you try to stay up current with current events and news stuff like that too?
Well, for me, unfortunately, I've got this fire hose called the internet, and it's on all the time. I'm just getting doused. And then in my personal reading, it's balanced between fiction and nonfiction. I think the world's an interesting and fascinating place. Fiction's a great place to explore these issues. I think the reason why it's important to do fiction is because it is an escape. You know, I mean, my first job is to entertain, right? But the root word of entertainment from the Greek is to literally to enter in and to seize, you know, and so you have to capture people's imaginations with great characters, which I always try to bring to the table. I spend most of my time actually building characters more than even, in some cases, some of the research, and trying to come up with, you know, conflicts between characters that parallel and further explain, you know, the events are going on. So for me, when I'm upset, angry, freaked out, interested, passionate, I know that's a subject for me to write about and to pay attention to both in my research and my writing.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I'd also say, you know, as you mentioned in your introduction, my day job is I chair a political party in Ohio. And so, you know, that makes writing a book tough because I'm not doing it during the day. I'm doing it. And I also have 2 little kids. So I'm doing it a chapter between 10 and 11 or a chapter in the morning or you name it. But it does put me in a place where I'm seeing current events play out, especially in the topics I write about, you know, campaigns, elections, politics. And so I'd say every one of my books, the central insight that leads to the bigger plot, and the book is called The Voter File. I didn't get into all the details in the introduction, but the voter file is this very large database of all the voter information that both parties have. And on the insiders, they all know exactly what it is, and they know it's a big deal. Outsiders, which is most people, probably are like, voter file, that sounds a little creepy. Is there a file of voters out there on all of us? And the answer is yes. And so a lot of my insights, you know, my first book was all about the curse of gerrymandering. And I wanted to tell a story based upon living and dealing with it every day that sort of put in terms that readers can understand the ramifications and the risks presented by gerrymandering. I wrote a second book that's all about dark money and what is allowed today in our world of super PACs and hidden money. And the third one gets into a number of issues, but I'd say beyond history, and I happen to also be a history major, and I agree with a lot of what Mike said there. One thing I think that's allowed me to get a little bit ahead of the curve, and when the book's sitting there waiting to be published, I've been worried for a year, oh gosh, events are going to catch up to my book and it's going to look like I was writing about what just happened. That didn't happen. I'm very glad for that. But I think being in a position where I'm seeing the latest of everything in politics has been helpful. I'll give a quick story though on this. My first book, and I don't know if you've read or heard about it, but it literally is about a Russian oligarch rigging an American election. And I wasn't trying to predict that. I actually started writing in 2012. And I picked Russia because I worked there years ago and I know a lot about it. And I thought I could come up with a good Russian oligarch. And it came out in 2016 before any of us knew what really happened. And now if I go on Amazon, I think one of the latest reviews was someone saying, well, what kind of book is that? We all know about that, as if I had written it after it happened. So, you know, I get very protective of my publishing date so people realize I wasn't cribbing from what just happened. But in that case, again, by trying to be very realistic and by thinking through, as I think you do as an author, okay, what would someone who wanted to cause harm really do? What would they think to do? How would they do it? You're kind of always going through that exercise in your mind. And if you really study it, you and that bad person in real life could very well come up with the same plot because there are only so many realistic ways to do certain things. So I think by knowing what's going on and by just the process of thinking through realistic causes of trouble, if that's what you're writing about, it puts you in a position to parallel people who are actually thinking about those things.
Yeah.
We had a question from Facebook asking what kind of nonfiction research is required to create a plausible plot, and does the real world work ever take the fun out of writing?
No, you know, I actually, this comes up a lot. how do I do both things? And the truth is they actually complement each other very well. As I said, I learn a lot, I see a lot. It adds to it. I think it creates insights to what I'm saying. And in this case, I think people are going to read the voter file and think, my gosh, I didn't know about this thing that he's talking about, this voter file. And I'm able to sort of talk about some of the things that are in one world that people don't see. So I think that the two complement each other very well. What was the first part of that question? I'm sorry.
What kind of nonfiction research do you do?
So I'm like everyone else, I'm keeping up with the nonfiction, look into, what's happening in the real world, and you want to capture it in fiction. I would not want anyone to leave my books and have a truly, uninformed or wrongly informed view of the world. So I'm always picking, a wonderful book by a great reporter named Jane Mayer, Dark Money. Read that, you'll know the entire system of what's happening right there. They're great books on gerrymandering. So I'm always trying to complement my own books as I write them with, and I'm doing this anyway because of my interests. But I'm always keeping up with those. And the truth is, there's so many that are coming out every month these days. It's hard to keep up. But the ones I really like the best are sort of deeply researched journalists like Jane Mayer, whose book Dark Money is like a Bible if you want to know what's going on in politics. So I try and find those as opposed to the latest tell-all that oftentimes, there's some in it, but it's not the deeply researched stuff like what Jane Mayer does.
Yeah, I mean, there's any number of sources that you can get from the internet, of course. I'm like David said before, I'm very blessed. My readers often tell me my favorite compliment is, I learned so much by reading your books. How do you know so much? And of course, the answer to that is my uncle Google and the interwebs. You can look pretty smart. Sidebar, in the Clancy franchise, of course, they're techno thrillers. And my previous series was techno thrillers. So I have a lot of technology connected to what I do. So I have a number of sources I find online and also in print that I access. But one thing I have to tip my hat to Tom Clancy. I was a Clancy fan before I was ever a Clancy writer. That guy was in public libraries with things called card catalogs. For you youngsters out there, there are these little cards like with words on them that you went through, and a thing called a microfiche. And so he was like digging out like top secret information that even people in the Pentagon weren't aware of through his public library research. So that guy was a genius researcher. I don't hold a candle to that, but I do work really hard at it. And one of the things I also do that's, believe me, not a chore, is traveling to the places that we write about. So we actually traveled, my wife and I traveled to Spain last year. The riots were still going on, riot/protest. It was 200 to 300,000 people in the streets with about a dozen knuckleheads setting fire to things late at night. But for the most part, it's very peaceful. But it was just awe-inspiring to be in the middle of a major European city, and suddenly 200,000 people come streaming by, the window, and to see what that means, what mass protest looks like. So always traveling these places that I can, staying up with the technology that's going on. That's what I love to do anyway. So it's not a chore at all. It's a joy and a blessing. I'm very privileged to be able to have this life and have this career. And basically my writing is a reflection of my life. And so to me, that's why it's not hard to do. It's hard work, but it's not hard to do.
And so, Mike, you mentioned you kind of had that extra added level of the technology because you have to live up to kind of this Tom Clancy who helped kind of create the subgenre of techno thrillers. Oh, yeah. So how do you balance, like we talked a little bit about, like kind of technology changing so fast, and how do you figure out like how much you're going to keep rooted in reality and how much you just get to take it and run and play with it?
That's a great question. My first job as a fiction writer is to entertain, to tell an entertaining story. And in those places where absolute technological truth gets in the way of a good story, I might simplify things. I might make things faster or speedier or more accessible than it otherwise might be. But I always stay true to the spirit of the thing that I'm writing about. I learned in my drone series years ago, I sat down when I started writing that first book, Drone, I thought, I'm gonna try to imagine, what could drones possibly do? I was really thinking like kind of future fiction. And boy, I was so proud of myself. I was coming up with these weapon systems, and man, I'm just like pat myself in the back. That's so awesome. Do a little Google research and find out everything I thought about is like 10 years old already. So, I mean, trust me, you can't keep up with it. You can't. So you take the technology serves the story, not the other way around. And so I bring in the technological elements that are fascinating to me, that I think are important, that not only have a bearing on the story and on the characters, but on all of us in our lives. And it's just amazing how our world's been transformed. The voter file is as an example, David, what you're writing about. The amount of data that's available on all of us all the time, I mean, it's growing exponentially. And who has access to that data and what they do with it is going to be one, I think, of the real political conversations, if not crises, in the next several years.
I agree. Yeah, this came up in a talk the other day. I mean, someone asked me, what do we do about this? Because the voter file, I think within like a few chapters, as a reader, you're worried, my gosh, do they really know? Do they have all this? And the truth is, for the most part, people are selling data, people are giving their data up, and a lot of that ends up in, not just Facebook or wherever, but in voter files and corporate files. And I do believe that, government is so broken right now, it's having a hard time keeping up with almost any type of reasonable regulation. And so it hasn't come close to the type of thinking on privacy, security, and what these major corporations should be doing to protect data, to protect individual interest in data. Andrew Yang, when he was running for president, not to get political, I was neutral in the primary, but he made a really good point. These companies, their big source of dollars is your data, but you don't get paid for it. They do. And they're running around trading and selling it. And I agree that the public sphere hasn't come up or even anywhere close to a system of managing and dealing with all the risks. There are opportunities with it, and we're all, like you mentioned, 23andMe, people love to see their genealogy, or I like to bike, so I use Strava. I don't know if people can see where I'm bike riding. I hope they're not. But so there's a lot of good to this stuff that we like, but I think on the back end, we still don't know nearly enough. And one of the things about the voter file I get into is we also have what are larger and larger data companies that we were all very excited about 10 years ago, entrepreneurship and new opportunities. But because there was such an excitement, no one ever figured out early on, well, we got to also regulate the tough side of this stuff. And so there's a lot of catching up to do.
David, I happen to notice that the rear tire on your 10-speed was a few pounds under pressure.
Exactly.
I was monitoring you yesterday. So
yeah. By the way, I also enter my weight on another app. I'm trying to, change. We're all doing it, and there's a lot of convenience. But like, I didn't read the fine print. I don't know where that's going. So I think there's a lot of private sort of individual self-policing, figuring out what you're doing. Like, don't do the genetic stuff unless you've really read it closely, and probably still shouldn't. And I think the government sector needs to really step up, and not from an ideological, I'm not saying when Trump says, shut down Twitter because I don't like it, that's the kind of regulation we're talking about. It needs to be a much broader thinking about this whole space of data and how we make more sense of it all.
Well, and like you said, we're also hypocrites. We whine about our loss of privacy, but then we are constantly giving it away, including doing things like videos on Facebook,
Here we are.
which will now live forever. And what's the old saw? If you're doing something for free on the internet, you're the product, and that's what we do. We want all this free stuff. We want all this convenience. We want to go to Walmart and buy cheap stuff, or go to Amazon and buy cheap stuff, and then we're worried about the fact that we don't have jobs and we destroyed the middle class. I mean, we want cheap and convenient, but we don't realize the ramifications for that, for our politics, for our community, for our economy. And technology is a driver a lot of that. I mean, there's just not a lot of good, clear thinking these days in many venues. And again, the fun and the joy and the responsibility as a writer is to help maybe raise the questions that need to be talked about in a way that's not being done mostly in the public space now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the internet is just noise. It's just constant noise.
So another question from Facebook. Bryce asks, what are some of your escape from work reading books that you would recommend? And second part to it, do you have any writers or books that you love that are kind of different from the stuff that you write as well?
So I go through phases depending on what I'm also doing sort of in my writing. But for most of my life, my number one favorite type of book were biographies. And on the shelf behind me, all across the thing here, are, I'm sure on most people's shelves, Truman and Teddy Roosevelt and all the great biographies, and, the newer Hamilton one, the newer Grant one. My favorite is Caro's LBJ series. And these are not just the lives, but the writers have turned these lives into incredible, rich. I mean, if you've never read, and most people, I guess, watching this have, if you've never read Cairo, the first chapter on LBJ about being, from the hill country of Texas, and his relatives were working as hard as they could, but they never knew the soil was so thin it would never get them. I read that 25 years ago. I have a bad memory. I do not forget it. And so I'd say a lot of ironically, because I'm now writing fiction, I was more consumed with those types of books and history, but mainly biography. Now I'm mixing it up a lot more. It helps me think about good writing, to read, current writers. Right now, next to me, I'm rereading All the King's Men, trying to sort of thinking through, the iconic political book. And interestingly, my main character is a reporter, and obviously the narrator in All the King's Men is a former reporter. So they're parallels. But so I'm reading a lot more fiction now and mixing it up. But the heart of my reading for most of my life was biographies and nonfiction with the standard thriller thrown in there.
Yeah, I echo that. I mean, biographies to me are endlessly fascinating. I'm in the middle of a Washington biography right now. The great documentarian Ken Burns, who does these amazing stories. Someone asked him once, I understand, why don't you do fiction? He said, because God tells the best stories. Why would I make stuff up? And that's why I think biographies are so powerful. You mentioned before, David, about authenticity. I mean, when you read about a real person's life, that's the authenticity we're all looking for. We're looking for something true and something that can ground us. And then to see how real people lived out their lives and faced the conflicts and challenges of their day is encouraging for us. It's also great fuel for me as a writer as I'm building my characters. Life is conflict. All novels, comedy, romance, thrillers are driven by conflict. And the great biographies are about the human story, and the human story is about struggle in this life. So I agree with you.
And so good. Another question from Facebook. Tricia asks, in our current political situation, do you think it's time to retire the phrase truth is stranger than fiction when there are so many parallels?
I actually may be accurate. Given what we said earlier, truth, what's actually happening, again, if I had go back to my first book, a Russian oligarch rigs an American election. At the end of my book, not to give it away, but people are so horrified when they discover what happened. The last chapter is this great bipartisan coming together to say, we can never let that happen again. And at one point, someone wrote to me, and I'm dreaming up these crazy plots and tension and no one getting along. But at the end, I assumed when I wrote that plot in 2014 or 15, of course, if we figure this out, we would do something. And someone wrote me back then, I think your end is very unrealistic. That would never happen. And I thought, what a cynic. I can't imagine that if all that happened, we wouldn't come. That person was right. And me even trying to be dreaming up bad plots, I never thought realistically that if all that came true, you wouldn't do something about it. So yeah, I actually think these days, as much as people like Mike and myself are trying to come up with good fiction, some of it is stranger and frankly, disturbing or worse. I wish that some of the things I dreamed up were the worst things happening that people could imagine, but some of the truth is actually, at least, catching up or sometimes lapping some of the fiction we come up with. So I think they're at least tied, if not truth, getting even ever stranger by the day.
Yeah, not truth is stranger than fiction, just truth is strange. Right. It's really hard to believe what we're living through right now, what we're going through. A friend of mine years and years ago said, from a historical perspective, it's always the worst it's ever been. At least that's how it feels. And so, again, I think I take comfort and solace from the fact that humanity is pretty much the same forever, and we've faced far worse problems in the past. It seems more horrific right now than it is. It's serious what's going on, but we'll find a way. We really will. And I think the challenge right now is not so much trying to balance truth versus fiction, but we got to start deciding what are the eternal truths that are actually true. What can we agree upon that's actually true? I think what's so frustrating for me right now is I think facts now are up for negotiation. Facts now are pretty much irrelevant to narrative, right? So we're pretty much all just showing up to the internet or to our news sources with our narrative and just sort of cycling out and filtering out the things that don't fit our narrative. So I think as a community, one of the things we need to do is recommit to a desire to know the whole truth and nothing but the truth, not the selective and narrative truth. And man, and I don't mean to ramble here, I apologize, but I also feel like we're beyond politics now. Politics is about rationality and negotiation and compromise and finding the middle ground, and we've lost the middle ground. And I'm not trying to sell soap here, but one of the reasons why I was looking at the Spanish Civil War and then what's going on in Barcelona a couple years ago, 3 years ago now, is we're very rapidly approaching that point. There's a point at which there is no more negotiation. And when politics is dead, what's left? It's the state that has the monopoly of force. That's, states have armies and states have police forces. And when suddenly you're concerned or afraid of what the state may or may not be doing, then all hell breaks loose. And I tell you what, a little love your neighbors yourself. I would like to recover a little bit of that. If we can't do the politics, let's at least get back to one of those truths. Sorry.
And you mentioned Spain again, and you said being able to kind of travel and do that has kind of really informed the books and what you're working on. So how is not being able to travel right now while you're potentially working on another book kind of impacted what you're working on?
Well, certainly the good news is the restrictions are lifting and different places are more open than others. Yeah, it's frustrating. But again, thanks to this device that sucks all of my personal data into it as I give it to it, it's amazing what you can do. If there's places you can't go, there are people that do nothing but take their cell phones and walk around major cities. And so if you've never walked the streets of, Budapest, now you can. And so if you're a writer and you can't travel, there's no excuse not to know what, downtown Budapest looks like. So there's still lots of opportunities and access for information. But of course, that's no substitute for actually being there. Because of my deep commitment to the truth and to research, amazingly, I find myself in a lot of restaurants overseas, spending a good time bending the elbow and scraping the fork on the plate, and can't do that on the interwebs. So I do miss that.
And David, you mentioned the Russian connection with the first book because you lived there. So do you travel much for your writing, and has that impacted your writing process at all?
It's harder now. So one of the things I've enjoyed about my books now is although I draw from my international experience, and there are scenes throughout the voter file in Kazakhstan and in Ukraine and Russia, and I travel to those places. But as Mike says, it's incredible. I look back to what authors would have done before. It is incredible how much you can do through the internet, see the places, learn about them. And to think back to people writing books like these 50 years ago, I mean, I don't know, they must have all had to travel. So I'm able to do that. But the thing I've tried to do to my books that's fun is I'm here in Ohio, and I love capturing the places that aren't often in books, that we are all at every day, but never think about as a source of a plot of a book. So, if you've ever driven from Ohio to Washington, D.C., a little past halfway on that drive is this town called Breezewood. And it's famous because it advertises itself from 100 miles away. It's got 30 motels. The reason it's a town is because they never finished the highway. So you have to get off and get back on. So there's all these rest stops. Well, I love having a chase scene in Breezewood, PA. So I've been there a bunch because I travel there. And I have, scenes in Mansfield, Ohio, Lake Erie, traveling Eastern Ohio down where they now do fracking, but also, this is one of the big areas of interest because it used to be Democrat and Trump did so well there. So I love to get into sort of the nooks and crannies of small towns in the Midwest. The voter file, for instance, starts in Wisconsin, in Appleton. And I did drive to Appleton from Chicago to really nail the drive. And so one of my goals has been to get out of Rome and London and DC and get into smaller towns that once you get to them are fascinating and interesting, and they all have their own stories to tell. And one of the things that's been a small benefit is after 16, politically, and because my books are always getting into the politics of these areas, I don't want to claim that I'm, what's his name, J.D. Vance, but by focusing so much on what's happening in small towns, Ohio, and the struggling economy and the new economy with fracking, it has also been a window for a lot of people into what the heck's happening in the Midwest that, you know, in the end was the reason that Trump became elected. So I think in doing that, hopefully there's interesting geography, interesting people, but to the extent a lot of people reading my books are also politically minded, it's trying to get in a fiction way into what's making these towns tick. So I certainly am always in those towns. And I'm sure as Mike is when he's anywhere, always looking around. You know, the Board of Elections I describe in Monroe County, Ohio, in a book is very similar to what the actual one looks like. It's a little tiny, it almost looks like a tiny real estate office or something. And that's true, you know, all over the state. And that's one of my favorite parts is bringing life to these places that often aren't getting much attention in sort of modern book writing.
All right, and we've got one more question before we finish for both of you. So Bryce asks, Mike, do you like the Jack Ryan TV show? And David, is there any interest with Jack Sharp being turned into live action, and who do you think would play him?
Yeah, I love the Jack Ryan show for a bunch of reasons. I love John Krasinski, the actor. Some people don't realize that the new Amazon series is a reimagining of the Jack Ryan series. So it's old Jack Ryan set in a modern context. But because it's a young guy, I think it's Jack Ryan Jr. So I'm constantly complimented on the amazing Amazon show that clearly they're using my stuff. And of course, so I get to bask in the credit, but I don't have to do any of the hard work of actually doing a TV show. So I think the show's a lot of fun. I think they're really smart to update it. It's a parallel universe to what I'm doing because it's a reimagining of characters and scenarios, and of course it's updated. And I'm sorry to hear that, I guess because of the virus, they're not doing the third season, or at least postponed for a while.
Yeah.
I think there's a real desire and a hunger for the Jack Ryan character. You know, some people say, doesn't it get old writing about the same characters? And I'm like, no. Jack Ryan Sr., the president, you know, he is a guy who always does the right thing. He does what's best for the country, even at his own expense. And we need to recover those kinds of politicians again of both parties. You know, please make decisions on behalf of the American people, not for your own narrow, you know, political agenda. And I think people keep coming back to this series because they love the idea of politicians who are truly public servants. And we've lost that, I think, in the last few years. So yeah, I'm excited to see what they do with the Amazon series. I hope they keep pushing it out. I hope they expand the universe. I really do.
Yeah, on my end, I am so excited to be publishing with Putnam in this way that I've spent years trying to figure out the publishing world, and I feel like I'm making some good headway here. So from the outsider perspective, the whole movie world seems even more complex of how you take what's a good story and turn it into something. I've asked around some. I have some people in the industry. I have someone helping. I've had people approach me after my first book for rights and all that. But what I have never wanted is to have just sell something and have it sit in some studio for years and never go anywhere. But in the end, you know, I'm having some of those conversations. But yeah, I'd love this. I think it would be a very interesting movie. I think it actually, each of my books I could see being a series of a streaming series. They each would have their own sort of, I think, year. They would make sense that way. So we'll see if that comes, and hopefully the positive response we're getting so far from this will get that attention. But again, as someone who's newer to this, figuring out these worlds, if you're I started writing a book out of the blue. I was a party chair, kind of minding my own business. And from that point to here is like a mountain. And figuring out how you then turn all that into something on screen, I still am like doing baby steps, but I finally have some good people around me who are helping. But overall, you know, yeah, I can see it, and not to be, you know, immodest, but I feel like, and I'm sure Mike, you think this too. I see a lot of things out there that I think, hey, my story's better than that one. How do I get there? Because I do think, you know, a number of these books are ones that I could easily see being being fun, exciting, and sort of, not educational, but movies that would also bring home some message for people looking for something.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. So everybody, we've been talking with David Pepper, whose new book, Voter File, just came out last Tuesday. We have signed book plates for it. And we've been talking with Mike Maden about the new Tom Clancy, Jack Ryan Jr. book, Firing Point. It comes out this coming Tuesday, and we've got signed book plates on the way. Mike just dropped them in the mail for us. We are still closed at the store for browsing. Hopefully that will change in a couple of weeks. We're working on the next process, but we're still taking online orders at murderbooks.com. You can email us at order@murderbooks.com or call us at 713-524-8597. So if you enjoyed tonight's chat, please consider purchasing one of their books. If you want to check out our other recent author events, we also just started a YouTube channel. We've got all of them on there. This one will be up here soon. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Good luck with the books, and hopefully we'll get to see you this time next year in the actual bookstore.
Awesome.
Thanks, John.
Thanks so much.
Nice to meet you, David.
Nice to meet you.
Congratulations on your book.
Thanks.